As you can see in the footage behind me, this mini PC absolutely crushes my previous most powerful mini PC I've had access to testing, the UM780XTX, although this is about exactly the size of two UM780XTXs stuck together. This is also still much smaller than my full desktop PC, where I could fit this thing inside of it, and it's about the same size as my 4090, and this is also much smaller than a gaming console like the PlayStation 5. So while it is still a mini PC, it's certainly isn't as small as some of the smaller ones, but is still rather small. But it does pack a lot of power here. You can see it absolutely crushing the integrated graphics on the Radeon 780M, but that's because this has dedicated graphics. This has the RX 7600M XT inside, and frankly, the CPU in this thing is ridiculously powerful to where actually for a gaming build, I think it's a bit imbalanced. That being said, it's a 16-core part with the Dragon Range Ryzen 9 7945HX. You certainly wouldn't complain about having the ridiculous amounts of CPU power, but gaming doesn't really need those 16 cores, which means if they could have fit a weaker CPU and more powerful GPU into the same price budget, I think that would have been a better way to go for gaming performance. That being said, you can see in the side-by-sides here that this absolutely crushed my Minisforum UM780XTX. Now this is the AtomMan G7 PT, and my understanding is that AtomMan is a sub-brand of Minisforum. Minisforum Contact has sent me the review samples for both of these. So just be aware that these aren't really competing companies here, but you can kind of see how they match up head-to-head. Now, the increased CPU performance is certainly welcome in a game like Baldur's Gate 3, where again, we didn't really need the 16 cores, but you can actually see in this test here that the GPU is actually not the bottleneck here, it's a CPU, and this game can be very CPU limited. And we're actually getting very good performance here, which a lot of other systems are unable to do. Now I'm shifting the performance comparison here for a second. So the most recent mini PC I've had the opportunity to test out is also from AtomMan. This is the X7 Ti, and this is an Intel-based system with Intel Arc graphics and an Intel Core Ultra 9 185H. However, that in my testing actually still couldn't even outperform AMD's slightly older Radeon 780M that you've seen in the previous side-by-side footage. So if you're looking at between the AtomMan G7 PT and the AtomMan X7 Ti, for gaming performance, this G7 PT absolutely crushes it. Like you can see over 5 times the frame rate in something like Call of Duty here is just absolutely ridiculous in comparison. Although again, the X7 Ti system is a bit smaller. It has a built-in webcam, a little screen on the front of it. So maybe it's targeting a different use case. But the performance numbers here are absolutely ridiculous. Now, all of these were outfit with 32 gigabytes of memory and a terabyte SSD. Again, as one of the options coming from the manufacturer, you can also buy these bare bones for less money and then kind of outfit those other pieces of the system like RAM and SSD yourself. Now, in general, though, the performance was so good for this AtomMan G7 PT because I think it has that dedicated graphics rather than integrated graphics. I ended up realizing that I should probably actually not just compare this against these smaller mini PCs with integrated graphics, and instead it actually probably makes sense to think about how would this compare against an actual desktop system. So that's what I want us to look at next, because I really think that the main thing you have to decide when you're looking at a PC like this is, are you wanting to spend the extra money to get the small form factor, where you gain the form factor and you gain, I mean, that's what you gain. You gain the form factor, you lose a bit of upgradability, and there's a price you pay versus if you threw together a build. Like I was looking at, okay, if I've used a Ryzen 5 7600X to build a desktop PC, I'm losing a ton of multi-threaded CPU performance, but not a lot of gaming performance compared to what we're seeing in this AtomMan PC. And that would allow us to probably save a lot on our budget. So if I throw together a build, I didn't think too hard about these parts. These are more just placeholders to get a rough price comparison, where you get 32 gigabytes of DDR5 6000CL30 memory on a reasonable motherboard, some cheap cooling. Throw in an RTX 4060, which is going to be somewhat comparable to the 7600M XT that we get in this AtomMan PC. And then I found just some random mini tower case, which again, this will be much bigger than what you're getting in this AtomMan system. So if you're really chasing that smaller build, you know, just be aware of that. And this is not a real high-end power supply, but again, you're not getting some super beefy power supply on the mini PC either. So this is coming in at about $864. Although again, it's bigger, although it is also more upgradable and is saving you money compared to the full-on AtomMan G7 mini PC, which, as I'm looking it up on their sale, is $1,200 as it's configured in my video, right? Now, so I decided then to look at how does this compare up against a desktop PC with that RTX 4060 inside? Now, to be clear, this RTX 4060 footage was actually captured on my desktop PC that I use for GPU benchmarking, which actually has a 7800X3D CPU. So if you did want to look at the price comparison with a 7800X3D CPU inside, we could factor that in, but actually, interestingly, that actually makes these about the same price. Although some of these components, again, aren't exactly the ones that are in my system, you get the idea. So anyway, honestly, the 4060 is usually going to be the bottleneck, not the rest of the system, so that ends up not being particularly relevant. What you're mostly going to look at here, because both systems have a high-end CPU inside, is you're really looking at the 7600M XT GPU up against the RTX 4060 GPU. And then I realized that I should probably run the AtomMan PC through my actual, high-end GPU benchmark suite rather than what I was doing for my mini PCs, where I usually use much lower settings, but it was crushing those integrated graphics mini PCs. So let's go ahead and now look at how does this mini PC do up against a RTX 4060 based desktop PC. Well, we can see that in the latest Unreal Engine 5 showcase with Hellblade 2 at 1080p high settings, neither system can hit 60 FPS and high is the maxed out settings in this game. Although this game doesn't really need a high frame rate to be enjoyable, we're seeing 43 FPS average versus 39, which is a 10% advantage to the 4060 and a larger advantage in the 1% lows. My kids sound like they are rolling around on their desk chairs up above me again on the hardwood floor. They must have forgot I was filming right now. That's okay. Anyway, 1080p medium settings do get us to 60 FPS and actually a perfect match in averages and 1% lows on both systems. So, latest Unreal Engine 5 showcase at medium settings runs at 60 FPS on this mini PC. So, very good experience here overall. Now we can go ahead and adjust the settings up to what about 1440p gaming rather than just 1080p? Well, at 1440p, the medium settings are playable in the 40 FPS range, but not getting that 60 FPS experience. Again, this is a game where on consoles they chose to go with like a 30 FPS cap to my knowledge, so it's not really a game designed around 60 FPS gaming, and we're in the mid 40s here. 43 FPS versus 41 gives the 4060 a 5% advantage and a 3% lead in the 1% lows. But if we use some upscaling using FSR and DLSS at the quality setting, which I would say is a bit of an image quality advantage to the DLSS image here, then we actually are getting around 60 FPS. It's 58 versus 65 on the 4060 based system, so 12% advantage to the 4060 based desktop and a little bit of an image quality advantage in motion, where I feel FSR pixelates a little bit more in motion and on disoccluded artifacts. Next, I tested out Ghost of Tsushima, which at 1080p very high settings, which is the maxed out settings in the game, I actually saw the AtomMan mini PC taking a small lead here by 4% at 72 versus 69, nice, and a 7% lead in the 1% lows at 63 versus 59. So it is a bit of a win here, but it's, again, really comparable performance. You're not going to notice much difference on either PC. If we move up to 1440p very high settings, we're now dropping below 60 FPS, and both systems are actually perfectly tied at 49 FPS average and 41 FPS in the 1% lows. So it's also, I should point out that the GPUs in these systems are reporting about the same power usage at about 115 watts-ish most of the time. So fairly interesting on that. Now, let's go ahead and look at what if we turn down to high settings. Well, if we go down to high settings, both GPUs average 60 frames per second, so there's your 60 FPS experience, although it's not going to be locked. Your 1% lows are down in the 50s at 52 and 51 respectively, so 2% lead for the G7 from AtomMan here in the 1% lows, but again, you're getting basically the same experience, and you're getting a good 1440p experience in this game at the high settings. Now, we could use some upscaling at 1440p using FSR and DLSS at the quality setting. We're now getting a fairly high refresh rate experience on both systems with the 89 FPS versus 87, which is 2% advantage for the 4060 base desktop, and they're tied in the 1% lows at 75. So again, a very good experience here. Now, this is also a game that does feature frame generation, so I went ahead and tried that out as well. So here we're looking at FSR and DLSS at the quality level upscaling with frame generation activated. However, you'll notice that the RTX 4060 isn't really gaining performance with frame generation activated. I'm guessing it's spilling over the VRAM capacity, and I've noticed in my own testing that DLSS frame gen tends to use more VRAM than FSR3 frame generation, or at least react worse to spilling over that 8 gigabytes of VRAM. So that's my explanation for what's happening here. So I went ahead and used FSR3 frame generation on both systems, although the underlying upscaling is FSR versus DLSS, because I do think DLSS still has the image quality advantage here. Now we are getting more performance out of the AtomMan G7, but now it's a much closer result of 137 FPS versus 111, which is 23% advantage and a 27% advantage in the 1% lows. If we move on to Horizon Forbidden West at 1080p maxed settings, which are called very high in this game, we get an interesting result, which is the 4060 has higher averages by 39%, but it's getting larger stutters on the frame time graph, giving it a loss in the 1% lows. The thing is, both GPUs are running over the 8 gigabyte VRAM buffer at the very high settings in this game, and it's causing both of them to have issues which are presenting differently on the two systems. Either way, that's not the way you'd want to play on either system. So if you reduce down to high settings, the game does a much better job of operating within an 8 gigabyte VRAM buffer, and so at 1080p high settings, we're seeing 70 FPS and 60 FPS respectively, giving 17% advantage to the 4060 based desktop PC, and a 12% lead in the 1% lows at 58 versus 52. So this is definitely a way you could enjoy the game, and it does look like it prefers the NVIDIA GPU in this game. If you wanted a higher refresh rate experience, you'd go down to medium settings and get 97 FPS on the RTX 4060 and 83 FPS on the Mini PC, giving a 17% advantage to the RTX 4060 and a 19% advantage in the 1% lows at 80 versus 67. So very high refresh rate experiences available at 1080p. What if we go ahead and move up to 1440p? Since we knew that the very high settings were problematic with the VRAM buffer, I tried out the high settings at 1440p, and we're getting playable experiences here, but definitely not breaking 60 FPS on either GPU. Here we're seeing 51 versus 43, which is a 19% advantage in the averages for the 4060 based desktop, and a 22% lead in the 1% lows at 44 versus 36. So one way we could try to chase a higher frame rate would be to use upscaling, and so here we're using FSR and DLSS at the quality setting. This is one of the games with the newer FSR 3.1 upscaling. I do still think DLSS has the better image quality. If you look at things like the hair in motion, it does seem to be a bit more put together on the DLSS image. It's a 15% performance advantage as well for the 4060 based desktop PC, and a 16% lead in the 1% lows at 59 versus 51. If we didn't want to use upscaling, we could try moving down to the medium graphics preset. And if we do that, we see 67 FPS versus 58, giving a 16% advantage to the 4060 based desktop PC. And the 1% lows are 59 versus 51, which is a 16% advantage. Again, the native resolution performance at medium settings seems to be very close to what we saw happening at the high settings with upscaling. So I went ahead and also tried out the medium settings with FSR quality and DLSS quality upscaling, and now we're getting a nice high refresh rate experience on both systems. However, it is definitely a lead for the 4060 based based desktop PC at 92 FPS versus 74 FPS, which is 24% advantage for the 4060 and in the averages, and a 22% lead in the 1% lows at 77 versus 63. I also tried out Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 basic settings. I've got some sound in the background there. Let's kick that off. Anyway, 1080p basic settings, because I'm turning down settings to chase a more competitive experience for the frame rate. Here it's interesting in that we're actually seeing the AtomMan PC take the lead by 16% at 199 versus 171, and the 1% lows at 132 versus 107, 23% lead in the 1% lows. If we move up to 1440p resolution, we're getting good results on both PCs, but it is still a win for the AtomMan PC at 137 FPS versus 123. That's an 11% advantage. And the 1% lows are a 20% advantage at 85 versus 71. So if you're playing esports titles on these types of PCs with low graphics settings, it's looking like the AtomMan PC is definitely going to have you covered with a very good experience. But what about Cyberpunk? Well, at 1080p ultra settings, the GPUs are fairly evenly matched here in the averages at 76 and 75, but the AtomMan PC actually pulls ahead in the 1% lows by 9%, not a massive lead, but 59 FPS versus 54 in that lowest 1% of frames. You can see that the frame time graph just looks slightly smoother on the AtomMan PC. If we go ahead and kick it up to 1440p resolution, the ultra settings are a bit much if you're looking for a 60 FPS average. And here we're actually seeing the AtomMan PC pull ahead in the averages by 7% at 48 versus 45 FPS. And the 1% lows are an 8% advantage for the AtomMan mini PC at 39 versus 36. So it's a win for the AtomMan PC, but probably not the graphics settings we're looking for. So I tried turning down to high settings, and interestingly, both systems are now giving an identical performance at 55 FPS average, and the 1% lows are both 46 FPS average. Now, this is certainly very playable, especially on a variable refresh rate display where you're not trying to lock to 60 FPS or anything like that. But it did seem realistic that you might want to also kick on some upscaling. So if we kick on FSR and DLSS at the quality setting, both GPUs gain performance, but it looks like the 4060 gained a larger advantage. Also, I do think DLSS looks noticeably better in this game if you look at the fine details. Here we're seeing 16% performance lead for the 4060-based PC at 87 versus 75, and the 1% lows are a 13% advantage for the desktop 4060 PC at 68 versus 60. So let's go ahead and look at Alan Wake 2. Now, this is one of the latest graphical showcase type games, and at 1080p high settings, neither PC is giving you 60 FPS, but I also don't really think you need 60 FPS for this game. It is very slow paced. A lot of just kind of taking in the scenery, but we are seeing 49 FPS versus 45, giving a 9% lead in the averages to the AtomMan, but it's struggling in the 1% lows, and we're going to see that continue, where the 4060 took a 28% lead in the 1% lows at those settings. Once I went down to low settings, well, the averages remain fairly close at 59 versus 56, actually giving the AtomMan PC a 5% lead in the averages. If you look at the frame time graph, it's a lot spikier on the AtomMan PC, giving a 52% lead in the 1% lows to the 4060-based desktop. Now, I think that this comes down to, I've just seen some of my AMD GPUs really struggle in this test scene in Alan Wake 2, and this seems to be the case here. If we move up to 1440p resolution but use upscaling, you can get a playable experience at the high settings, where we're seeing a 19% lead in the averages for the AtomMan PC at 51 versus 43. And neither PC is doing great in the 1% lows here, and it's actually slightly better for the AtomMan PC at 27 versus 25, so an 8% advantage there for the AtomMan system. However, if we go ahead and switch to low settings with quality level upscaling, again, FSR versus DLSS, we're actually now seeing the 1% lows get much better for the 4060-based system, but they're not getting much better for the AtomMan PC, giving an 86% lead in the 1% lows, and the frame time graph looks much spikier. So this is and it's a 16% advantage in the averages. So it's certainly a much better experience in this game on the NVIDIA-based PC, and that's where I think the issues are, is probably coming down to that. I also wanted to throw in at least a little bit of ray tracing. So Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora uses ray tracing on all settings, and if we use 1080p ultra settings, Neither PC is doing great, but we are seeing an advantage to the 4060 by 11% at 41 versus 37 FPS average, and a 13% lead in the 1% lows at 34 versus 30. However, those probably weren't the settings you'd be wanting to play the game at. So if we went down to high settings, which still includes ray tracing, we're now seeing both GPUs much more playable. It's 55 versus 51 in the averages, lead for the 4060 base desktop by 8%. And the 1% lows are 44 versus 42, which is a 5% advantage to the 4060-based system. Now, we could turn things down a little bit further. If we go down to the medium settings, we get a little bit more performance. The 4060 is now breaking 60 FPS here at 62 versus 58 on the AtomMan system, giving a 7% advantage to the 4060 desktop. The 1% lows are 50 versus 47, giving a 6% lead for the 4060 base desktop. So we are certainly seeing the NVIDIA GPU taking a lead in these ray tracing tests, but not by a massive margin. However, if we move up to 1440p resolution, if I go down to medium settings and upscale at the quality setting, again, image quality advantage to DLSS here, especially if you look at things like the fence line in the background, stuff like that. The 1% lows are the big difference here at 54 versus 37, 46% lead for the 4060 base desktop, and a 19% lead in the averages at 68 versus 57. So at that higher resolution, we saw a bit more separation there. All right, that is all of the tests that I ran on these systems, and I think you'll agree that the overall summary here is up against integrated GPUs. It's just absolutely no contest. We are crushing the competition, but it's also a larger system. Like I said, it's about the size of 2 of the UM780XTX-based mini PCs stuck together, and it's also more expensive. So, you have to ask yourself then if it made sense to look at a desktop PC, where if I looked at it up against an RTX 4060 based desktop PC, which you could put together for less money, you get similar performance on the 4060 based desktop PC, but that will be a desktop PC. So even if you go for a relatively small case, it is going to be a bigger system, although it'll also be more upgradable. So there's something to say for this AtomMan mini PC if you're looking for something that is very small, but it is, there's trade-offs there. And that's kind of tends to be the situation with mini PCs in general, is how much are you willing to pay and how much upgradability are you willing to lose for that form factor. Also, we have the lighting system, which is kind of cool because you can replace, I think if you made your own little shapes cut out, you could put your own designs there. The problem is, at least for now, there doesn't seem to be any control over the lighting system other than on and off, which means that it just kind of cycles through RGB pretty rapidly, like 2 seconds per change. And personally, I find that distracting, and I would turn the lighting system off. It would be cool if Minisforum could update the BIOS to give maybe more control over the lighting, maybe just to leave it at one color and stay there, something like that. Also, again, while testing thermal performance isn't my specialty or anything like that, I usually just review GPUs rather than these types of systems, none of the temperatures seemed crazy. I was in the performance mode because it does have a shift in the fans between, and it really didn't actually matter in the little bit of testing I did on the more on the lower fan and power budget, because it really limited the power of the CPU to about 65 watts instead of 85 watts from what I could tell, and it slowed the fans down. But really, it kept the system very cool in gaming workloads, and again, the CPU is kind of overkill on all those cores anyway. So I was actually fairly impressed with the cooling system and the fan system on this PC. It's really actually kind of a cool design when you open it up. So while these cooling systems aren't really my specialty or anything like that, as far as I could tell, it seemed to be a well-built system, and I had no issues with that. The other thing I'll mention about whether you're buying this bare bone or with the 32 gigabytes RAM and 1 terabyte SSD is that the page seems to advertise the fact that you could put in a PCIe Gen 5 SSD. It comes with a Gen 4 SSD, at least in my review sample. But again, in like gaming performance, that's not that big of a thing. But it does look like you could save $200 and add in your own RAM and SSD if you wanted to customize that a bit more for yourself. So overall, I'm impressed with the overall performance of the system. I like the form factor. I think it's really cool what you can do here. Just be aware that you could try to build your own system and sacrifice some of that size for better value. But I think we all know that to get these tiny systems, there is going to be a bit of a price premium to do that. And this is certainly the most capable mini PC that I've tested. It does look like, well, I haven't tested them myself. Asus is offering some small systems with like up to an RTX 4070 type mobile GPU in it, which I imagine could probably outperform the GPU in this system, but those systems also seem to have a much higher MSRP. Again, I don't have any of them on hand for testing myself. So hopefully you guys found this video useful and or interesting. Tried to focus on the gaming performance here. One interesting side note would just be that you are getting a massively powerful multi-threading CPU in the system. So if you have some sort of a use case for the 16 cores the system has on offer, that could potentially be interesting. But I focus on gaming performance in my channel, and that also seems to be what the marketing for this PC is focused on as well. So I focused on that here, but just be aware there's a massive CPU in this thing. So if that's something you're looking for in a tiny form factor, that could kind of be some icing on the cake as this thing goes. So hopefully you guys found the video useful and or interesting, and I hope everybody has an excellent day.